baby, once more. Anyway, yeah.
1967 is one of those years that gets talked about so much it's almost become a myth. The Summer of Love, Sgt. Pepper, psychedelia blooming out of every radio speaker.
Some other girl you knew before. Between the two of us, girls, you know I love you more.
But here's the thing about myths. They tend to flatten the reality underneath them. Because 1967 wasn't just one sound. It was a dozen sounds colliding at once. And the songs that actually dominated the charts that year reflect that chaos beautifully. Some of them are countercultural landmarks. Some of them are pure pop confections. All of them stopped people cold the first time they heard them. Let's get into it. Windy. The Association were one of those bands that the critical establishment never quite knew what to do with. Too polished for the rock crowd, too sophisticated for pure pop, too harmony-driven to fit neatly into any of the categories that music writers were assembling in real time during the mid-60s.
And Windy has stormy eyes that flash at the sound of...
They existed in a lane of their own, and Windy, which hit #1 in the summer of 1967 and stayed there for 4 weeks, is the clearest demonstration of what that lane sounded like at its absolute peak. The song was written by Ruth Ann Friedman, a folk singer-songwriter who reportedly wrote it in a single sitting, inspired by a free-spirited friend she wanted to capture in music. When she brought it to the band, they transformed it. The lush vocal arrangement that the Association layered onto Friedman's composition turned a personal folk sketch into something genuinely orchestral. Every voice had a role. Every harmony had a purpose. Nothing was accidental. What strikes you when you listen now is how the song manages to feel both airy and precisely constructed at the same time. The melody floats. The production underneath it is immaculate. There's a lightness to it that feels like it belongs to its exact moment in history. That specific window in the mid to late 60s, when pop music was trying to be beautiful and succeeding more often than not. Windy didn't get the retrospective love that some of its contemporaries did. It wasn't covered endlessly or cited as an influence by the next generation of artists, but it sat at the top of the American charts at the height of the Summer of Love, which tells you something important about what ordinary people were actually listening to while the countercultural narrative was being written elsewhere. Soul Man. Sam Moore and Dave Prater were one of the most combustible partnerships in soul music history. They genuinely did not get along for significant stretches of their career. Their personal relationship was fractious and complicated in ways that occasionally spilled into public view. And yet when they stood at a microphone together, something happened that neither of them could produce alone.
I'm a soul man. Yes, I am. I'm a soul man.
The tension didn't hurt the music. It charged it. Every call and response exchange between them sounds like two people trying to outdo each other in real time, because in many ways, they were. Soul Man was written by Isaac Hayes and David Porter, the songwriting team at Stax Records, who were in the middle of one of the most productive creative runs in soul history. Hayes and Porter had a gift for finding the intersection between personal identity and communal pride, and Soul Man sits right at that intersection. The narrator isn't just describing himself, he's making a declaration. He came up the hard way. He learned what he knows from necessity, and what he has to offer, the soul itself, is something that can't be faked or bought. The horn arrangement that drives the track is Stax in its purest form. Those Memphis horns, punchy and insistent and absolutely precise, create a rhythmic bed that makes the whole thing feel inevitable. The happening. By 1967, the Supremes were operating at a commercial altitude that very few acts in pop history had ever reached. Diana Ross, Mary Wilson, and Florence Ballard had scored an extraordinary string of #1 hits through the mid-60s, and the Motown machine behind them was one of the most finely tuned hit-making operations the music industry had ever seen. The Happening was their 9th #1 single, and in some ways it represents the peak of the classic Supreme sound before the internal tensions and personnel changes that would reshape the group began to surface more visibly. The song was written for the film of the same name, a caper comedy that history has not treated particularly kindly. The song survived the film by several decades and counting. It's a more complex composition than it might initially appear, built on a descending chord sequence that gives Ross's vocal performance something genuinely interesting to navigate. She isn't just delivering a melody, she's working with the architecture of the song, finding the emotional weight in each harmonic shift. What Motown understood better than almost any other label of its era was that production was not just decoration. It was an argument. The strings, the percussion, the way the backing vocals respond to the lead, all of it was making a case for the song before a single lyric landed. Ode to Billie Joe. Bobby Gentry wrote and recorded Ode to Billie Joe in approximately 30 minutes. That fact becomes more astonishing the more you listen to the song, because it is one of the most fully realized and deliberately constructed pieces of Southern Gothic storytelling that American music has ever produced.
Today, Billie Joe McAllister jumped off the Tallahatchie Bridge.
The mystery at its center. What exactly was thrown off the Tallahatchie Bridge, and what exactly Billie Joe McAllister did before he jumped, was not an accident or an oversight. Gentry has said in various interviews that the question was never the point. The point was the family at the dinner table, eating and passing biscuits and absorbing devastating news without breaking stride. The song knocked Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band took the #1 spot, which is one of those historical footnotes that says something important about the breadth of what American audiences were responding to in 1967. Here was this spare, acoustic, deeply Southern narrative, arriving at the height of the psychedelic moment and simply overpowering everything else on the charts by being completely itself. No studio trickery, no orchestral production, just a voice, a guitar, a small string arrangement, and a story told with extraordinary compression and precision. Gentry was 22 years old when she wrote it. She grew up in rural Mississippi, and every detail in the lyrics, the chitlins and the black-eyed peas, the half a day's work in the fields, the casual cruelty of gossip in small communities, carries the weight of lived experience. You can hear the landscape in her voice. You can feel the heat. Groovin. Felix Cavaliere wrote Groovin sitting in his car on a Sunday morning, which is precisely the kind of origin story that makes complete sense once you hear the song. There is nothing hurried about it, nothing pressured or commercial sounding in the way that a lot of pop production in 1967 could feel when the machine behind the music was working too visibly. Groovin sounds like someone who had nowhere to be and decided to write something that felt like that exact sensation. It spent 4 weeks at #1 in the spring of 1967, and it earned every one of them. The Young Rascals were a genuinely integrated musical sensibility wearing a white rock band's clothing, which is both a simplification and a reasonably accurate description. They had grown up on soul and R&B, and Cavaliere's keyboard style reflected that background in every phrase. The vocal performance on Groovin is particularly remarkable for its restraint. He doesn't push, he floats. The melody moves at the pace of the Sunday it's describing, and the harmonies that come in behind him feel like friends joining a conversation rather than a production choice. The lyric is simple to the point of being almost abstract. A couple, a Sunday, the feeling of having time and someone to spend it with. That's essentially the entire emotional inventory of the song. But Cavaliere and the band found something in that simplicity that transcended it. Something that spoke to a specific kind of contentment that most people recognize immediately, and most pop songs are too ambitious to bother with. Light My Fire. Jim Morrison did not write the main riff of Light My Fire. Robbie Krieger did. And that clarification matters because the song is often remembered primarily as a Morrison statement, a piece of Dionysian theater built around his voice and persona.
Love become a funeral pyre. Come on, baby, light my fire.
When in reality, it began with a 20-year-old guitarist sitting down and writing something that changed the direction of the entire band. Krieger has said that Morrison challenged the band members to each write a song, and Light My Fire was his response to that challenge. He turned in something that nobody in the room was fully prepared for. The album version runs to 7 minutes, a substantial portion of which is given over to instrumental improvisation between Ray Manzarek's keyboard and Krieger's guitar, trading ideas over John Densmore's drumming in a way that drew more from jazz than from rock. When the label asked the band to cut the single down to radio length, they removed most of that improvisation, and the abbreviated version reached #1 and stayed there for 3 weeks in the summer of 1967. Both versions work. They work differently, but they both work. Morrison's vocal performance is the thing that tips the song into legend. He sings like someone who has decided that the normal register of human emotion is insufficient for what he needs to express. The lower verses are coiled and controlled. The choruses release everything that was held back. The dynamic shift between those two modes is what makes the performance feel dangerous in a way that most rock singing doesn't. Respect. Otis Redding wrote Respect in 1965 as a song about a man asking for basic acknowledgement from a woman he provides for. His version is good. It is confident and swaggering, and very much of its moment. And then Aretha Franklin recorded it 2 years later, reversed the gender dynamic completely, added a section that Redding hadn't written, and turned it into one of the most powerful statements of female autonomy in the history of recorded music. He heard her version and reportedly said that she had taken the song from him. He didn't mean it as a complaint. The transformation Franklin and her arranger Ted White made to the song went beyond the gender reversal. The tempo was tightened. The horn arrangement was made sharper, more aggressive. The backing vocals from her sisters were woven in with a call and response precision that gave the track a communal quality Redding's version didn't have. And then there was the bridge, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, spelling out the word like a declaration, like a lesson, like something being demanded rather than requested. That sequence was not in Redding's original. Franklin put it there and made it the most quoted moment in the song. By the time Respect hit #1 in the summer of 1967, it had already transcended its origins as a soul single. I heard it through the grapevine. Most people know this song from Marvin Gaye's 1968 version, which is understandable because Gaye's recording is one of the great vocal performances in soul history, and it reached #1 and stayed there for 7 weeks. But the song was recorded first by Gladys Knight and the Pips, who cut it at Motown in 1967, released it as a single that same year, and took it to #2 on the pop charts. Their version deserves its own examination, entirely separate from the shadow the Gaye recording would eventually cast. Knight was 23 years old when she recorded this. Her vocal performance is rawer than Gaye's, more urgent, less contained. Where Gaye would later build his version around a slow burn of dread and disbelief, Knight comes at the material with something closer to immediate devastation. The news has just landed. She hasn't had time to process it yet. That quality, the freshness of the wound, gives the Pips version an emotional directness that's almost startling. Norman Whitfield and Barrett Strong wrote the song specifically to capture the paranoia and heartbreak of learning that someone you love has been unfaithful through the worst possible channel, other people's mouths. The grapevine is not just a metaphor for gossip. It's a metaphor for the specific powerlessness of being the last to know something that everyone else already knew. To Sir with Love. Lulu was 18 years old when she recorded this, a Scottish singer who had already been working professionally for several years and who had a voice considerably larger than the pop world she'd been placed in. To Sir with Love was the title track of the Sidney Poitier film of the same name. A drama about a black teacher in a tough London school that handled questions of race and class with a directness that was still relatively unusual for mainstream cinema in 1967. The song was written by Don Black and Mark London to serve the film's emotional arc, and Lulu delivered it with a maturity that most performers twice her age would have struggled to find. The song was not initially released as a single in the United States. It appeared as the B-side to another track, and radio programmers began playing it anyway because listeners kept requesting it. It eventually hit number 1 and held that position for 5 weeks, making it the biggest American hit of 1967 by total weeks at the top. That trajectory, from B-side afterthought to year's biggest song, is one of the more unlikely success stories in pop history. What the song captures is a specific kind of gratitude that is very difficult to articulate in language, but apparently very easy to convey in a melody. The feeling of looking back at someone who changed the direction of your life and not having quite the right words but needing to say something anyway. The Letter. Alex Chilton was 16 years old when he recorded this. 16. The voice on this recording, that raw, cracked, adult-sounding instrument that opens with the words, "Give me a ticket for an aeroplane," belongs to a teenager from Memphis who would go on to become one of the most influential figures in American independent music and who, at the moment of this recording, was old enough to be in 10th grade.
When she wrote me a letter, said she couldn't live without me no more.
The disconnect between the voice and the age is one of the more genuinely startling facts in pop history, and it doesn't get less startling with repetition. The box tops were assembled largely as a vehicle for that voice, and the letter was given to them by a local songwriter named Wayne Carson Thompson, who had written it quickly and without particular commercial expectation. The production, handled by Dan Penn and Chips Moman at American Sound Studio in Memphis, stripped everything down to the essential. The track runs to 1 minute and 58 seconds, which makes it one of the shortest number 1 singles in rock era history. It doesn't feel short, it feels exactly as long as it needs to be. The urgency in the lyric, a man who has received a letter from a woman he loves and needs to get to her immediately by any available means of transportation, is matched perfectly by the urgency in the production. The drums hit hard, the guitar is jagged. 1967 didn't have one sound. It had all of these sounds running simultaneously, from Memphis soul to San Francisco psychedelia to British invasion pop to Southern Gothic folk. What united them was a collective belief that music could do something real, say something true, change how people felt about being alive. Listening back now, it's hard to argue that they were wrong. Subscribe and we'll see you in the next one.